my morning coffee and my Christmas mug. I've been back from the trail for 4 weeks and had a lot to think about as I get back into the real world. And as I requested on my last video, I got lots of great comments and suggestions on ideas of things to talk about. But one thing that has been on my mind a lot in this 4-week kind of re-entry process is the topic of fear. Thinking back on the things that I was scared of when I started the trail that turned out not to be fears, and things that I didn't even think about that were fears. So today I'm going to share with you my top 10 things to be afraid of on the Appalachian Trail and how they impacted me personally. Number 1, bears. That's something that I think is a very common fear, and honestly, when I was doing my training hikes through Georgia, I would always be just kind of hiking along and looking behind me and waiting for the bear to come up and attack me, because I had just not spent a lot of time in the woods during my adult life, and I was afraid that bears would be coming after me to get my food or watching me through the woods waiting to just kind of jump out in front of me. And it turned out that that was not an issue at all. And in fact, when I started hiking full-time at Deep Gap in North Carolina, that very day, I got on the trail, and all of a sudden that weight and that anxiety that was on top of me was just gone. And I don't know why. There was just something about the level of confidence that I got just from starting my thru hike that made me worry a lot less about bears. And that's not to say that bears are not an issue. They definitely can be. There's a lot of places, particularly around shelters, where they have been fed. And there's a saying that a fed bear is a dead bear, because when bears get acclimated to human food, they do become problems. And unfortunately now a lot of bears have to be euthanized rather than just relocated, because they have found, and I've gotten this from talking to people who actually in the process or in the were actively engaged in bear relocations, that even though they can move them very far away, sometimes they come back to where they know there's food. So it's important to be careful with your food. I always was, and I never had issues with bears in camp. They never came and messed with my tent or anything like that. They never got into my food bag. I saw 21 bears on the trail. My first bear sighting, which was 5 bears in one day, I was scared, but then I just kind of conquered that fear and moved forward. And when I saw the rest of the bears, which were all in the Shenandoahs, I had learned by then to yell at them and just kind of be the boss. And you know, if you have an authoritative voice and you tell them that you want them to get away, then pretty much they will. If it's a mama and babies, there was one time where I kind of backed off and gave her some space because she didn't want to leave, and 10 minutes later she had wandered on and I was in good shape. So that's number 1, is bears. Number 2 for me was falling. And this might not be a concern for a lot of people. I mean, I've seen some hikers just literally like dance across rocks, and I'm like, how on earth do they do that? And some of you may know, if you've watched a lot of my videos, that I was diagnosed with osteopenia when I turned 50, and that is pre-osteoporosis. And I actually had some osteoporosis in my spine, and my hips were sort of pre-osteoporotic. So I am obviously kind of young for that. I expected maybe when I was 50 or excuse me, when I was 70 or 80 that could be a problem, but it was really a surprise and almost felt like a death sentence when I first heard that. But I determined that wasn't going to stop me. So I went ahead with my hike with literally doctor's orders: don't fall down. And if you've hiked much on the Appalachian Trail or any other long trails like that, you know that falling down or not falling down is really not an option. I had a couple of pretty significant falls, but thankfully I didn't actually get severely hurt. I kind of messed up my knee and it bothered me for a few weeks. I landed on my ear, and I still actually, you can't see it, but I still have a place where the cartilage broke. That's how hard I fell. And I'm just thankful that I landed on my ear instead of right here, because I would have been completely knocked out and probably had a concussion. Anyway, falling was an issue, and that was a concern all the way up until the very end. I remember climbing up the Hunt Trail on my way to 𝐒𝐿𝐫𝐻, and there was a gap there that was probably, I don't know, like 6 feet. And I thought, my stride is not that long. I don't know how I'm going to get from one side to the other, but I literally stopped and I was saying a prayer out loud when another hiker came up behind me. I'm like, yeah, just give me a minute. I just need to get this prayer out of the way. And I did make the gap and, conquered that fear. I still don't like to fall, but it happens, and it's just part of life on the trail. Number 3, and this is one that is a huge concern for a lot of people, and for some reason it didn't worry me as much, but ticks. There are lots and lots of ticks on the Appalachian Trail, and I did take preventative measures. I treated all of my clothes with permethrin, and I retreated them every 6 weeks or so when I was in town. I did not treat my tent because I contacted 𝐒𝐻𝐫, the manufacturer of my tent, and they said that the permethrin is not a good thing to put on your tent. So I didn't treat my tent. I didn't want to damage it, but I did treat all of my clothes. I did as best as I could tick checks at night, but that's kind of hard to do if it's dark, you don't have a mirror, that sort of thing. So kind of just by touch, you sort of feel your skin and you see if there's anything out of the ordinary. I did not find any ticks on my body. I had several where I'd be hiking along and might look down and see one on my shirt and brush it off. There were a couple places where I was in camp and there were ticks on the tent, and I made sure that I got them off, but didn't have any concerns with tick bites, and thankfully as a result have not had any issues with Lyme disease. But that is something that a lot of people are scared of, and the best thing you can do about it is just be preventive and be vigilant about finding ticks and removing them. And if you need to, do that very carefully and save the tick if it's been embedded and you need to get checked for Lyme. The third one, and this was a concern for me, was camping alone. I had never camped alone, and I knew there would come a day where I needed to, and ironically the first time that I did was at Trent's Grocery in Virginia, and I thought my first night camping alone, and I'm not even on the trail. It was a little creepy. I was in the campground by myself. It was a Friday night, and there were some people kind of driving up and down the camp road in the middle of the night. I don't know what they were doing. I thought, are they doing drug deals? Are they making out? I don't know, but just leave me alone. So I stayed in my tent and just had a quiet night, and it was uneventful. There were a few other nights further up the trail where I did have to camp alone. I was in some shelters alone, but really it wasn't as much of an issue as I thought. So camping alone is something that I know some people say the first time they do it, they just feel incredibly empowered afterwards and like, I can conquer the world. I didn't have that feeling, but at the same time, I've done it and I know that I can. So I'd say that fear has been slayed. Hitchhiking was another one. I am not a hitchhiker. I'd never been a hitchhiker, and I didn't want to do it, but I knew there would be days where I would probably have to. Fortunately, I was able to work out where a lot of the shelters have, not the shelters, excuse me, the hostels will have pickup and return from the trailhead, so I took advantage of those opportunities when I could, or went to hostels that were within walking distance of the trail. So I really didn't have to hitchhike until I was going into Great Barrington in Massachusetts, and I was with friends then, so the three of us were able to get a ride, and it worked out fine. The guy that gave us a ride was actually the father of a former thru-hiker, so he could totally relate to what we were doing. And there were a couple other times as well, and each time it was a hiker town. They knew hikers and they were very comfortable picking up hikers, and no problems at all. Now, it's certainly something that I would not want to do by myself. Every time I did it, I had somebody with me. I think that's just kind of a reasonable precaution for a woman, but again, hitchhiking is something that I did. I got through it, and yeah, not a massive fear for me anymore, but again, not my favorite activity. Norovirus, oh goodness, that's one that you hear so many nightmares about that. I did not want to get it because I actually had norovirus a couple years ago at home, and God only knows where it came from, but I have never been so sick in my life. My husband's a nurse, and I was practically begging him to take me to the hospital or just kill me, one or the other, but thankfully it passed, and I avoided getting terribly dehydrated. And a lot of the hostel owners are taking very strong precautions now against noro. They've got a lot of advisories posted in terms of how to stay clean and that sort of thing. So it was not a big issue on the trail, and hopefully it won't be in the future, but it might pop up, and if it does, then the best thing you can do is use that hand sanitizer, keep clean, stay away from areas where there's noro, maybe stealth camp or camp a little ways away from a shelter if you hear of outbreaks there, or bypass a hostel if you hear that people are sick there. But norovirus can be very severe, but thankfully it wasn't an issue for me, at least on the trail this year. Hypothermia, that was another one of probably my top 3 concerns before I left, and I deliberately did some hikes in the winter, in snow, in very cold weather, just to test my gear and make sure that I would be, if not comfortable, at least warm enough. And that worked out pretty well. My quilt, when I switched from a sleeping bag to a quilt, I was in a Kelty sleeping bag, and it was 20 degrees and it was supposed to be down, but it just didn't keep me warm enough. But my quilt from Underground Quilts was amazing, and I also used a silk liner, but it was a silk liner that added about 5 to 7 degrees, and the quilt in the summertime I could just kind of lay it over me or even sleep on top of it, but it was cold in the winter, down even in the 20s. It comes with some straps around it that you can put on your sleeping pad and attach the quilt, so it kind of just wraps you up and cocoons you, and that with the long underwear that I slept in kept me very comfortable. Could pull the quilt up over my head and still get plenty of air, and so I was pretty warm, and I didn't have any nights where I was really concerned about hypothermia, but I did make it a point to be sure that I always had dry clothes. And that's something where I know some people go ultralight and they take just one set of clothes, and I'm like, gosh, what do they do when it's really cold and wet? Because when those days happen, you're not getting dry. So something to think about as you're planning if you've got a through hike in your future, but always keep some dry clothes and have something warm that you can change into. Just personal safety, and that's, some people are real concerned, like, should you take a gun on the trail, and do you need to worry about, you know, if you're a woman being attacked by a man, or, you know, who knows what else. I did hear about some issues where items got stolen. Lots of times that's when somebody leaves a backpack outside a store, and it's probably not another hiker, it might be somebody in a town that sees an opportunity. Not a huge issue, but I did hear about it a couple times. But personally, I did not fear for my safety. I started out with a neck knife and actually ended up sending that home. I didn't feel like I needed it, and I had, if you watch some of those videos early on, I had 3 knives and it took me a while to pare it down to 1, but that was one that I was comfortable letting go. Didn't carry a gun. I did meet one guy that had a gun, and you know, they're heavy. I would not want to tote a gun, particularly because, you know, I didn't think I would need it to stop a bear, and I certainly wouldn't want to shoot a person, so gun stayed at home. But as I said, personal safety was not an issue. I felt all the hikers that I met were really amazing. There were probably just 2 people that I met on trail who sort of gave me the creeps, and that was okay because I could just kind of keep my distance from them, and it was fine. So personal safety was something that just didn't keep me up at night, I guess. Snakes. Some people hate snakes. I don't like snakes, but at the same time, I respect them, and I think they're kind of cool to see from a distance. I saw lots of them. I nearly stepped on a few of them. But again, they're wild creatures, and they're out there in their habitat. So, you know, I'm tromping through their turf, and I just tried to give them space. And I did see a copperhead one day, and he didn't want to move from the trail. And I stayed there for a while, hoping that he would move, and he didn't. So I finally just gave him a wide berth and walked around off the trail and got back, and he was still there. And I don't know, he was a stubborn snake, but for the most part, the little ones, the garter snakes and the black snakes, and they see you and they scoot off. I didn't see any rattlesnakes. I don't want to, but yeah, they were out there on the trail, and I just was lucky enough that I didn't see any of them. But snakes were something that, yeah, don't love them, but I do respect them. I also respect bears. I should have said that as well. I've got a very healthy respect for bears, even though I'm not afraid of them. They're like big raccoons, and you just need to, you know, give them space to be bears, give snakes space to be snakes. And finally, and this is one that it was an issue in the summertime when we had a real bad heat wave, was running out of water. And as you saw in my video that I just did about the 𝐸𝐸𝐸 water container, I could carry up to 4 liters of water at a time, which is a pretty good amount of water. But there were times where you would hear the water sources were all dried up, or the water is bad at a shelter, and so you really had to just sort of be on top of the water situation so that you wouldn't want to run out of water. And there was one day towards the very end where I was kind of cutting it close and trying not to carry more water than I needed because I didn't want to carry the weight, and I did actually run out of water because I got to a source that was dry and couldn't get water when I needed it. So I rolled into camp and didn't have any water, and I was like, man, that was a mistake. Shouldn't have done that. But for the most part, if you've got gut hooks, you can look and see, and people will make notes about water sources and whether they're good, bad, dry, and you can anticipate that. If you know that you're going through a stretch where there's not good water, then you just have to carry extra. The most I carried, I think, was about 4.5 liters at one time, and that worked out okay. You sort of ration it, but at the same time, you don't want to not be hydrating. You need to be drinking the water, and so you have to make sure that you just suck it up and carry the extra weight if you need to stay hydrated. But didn't have any issues with waterborne illnesses, which is good. Always filtered my water, slept with my filter when it was cold, and was always able to get fresh water when I needed. And there were a couple times where, you know, if I was running low, another hiker would say, oh, I've got some extra water, and share, and that was really nice of them to do. And I also tried to do the same. And usually when I would get into camp, I would get the water that I needed. So I had 2 full liters or maybe 3 liters. liters because I didn't want to have to go back to the water source again in the morning. It was just a lazy thing that I didn't want to do. So typically I might have half a liter left in the morning that I could share with somebody so that they would save them a trip as well. And that's one great thing about hikers is they're all sharing and looking out for each other. So those are my top 10 fears. I don't know if you have some other ones that that I didn't cover, but those are also the most common ones that I hear from other hikers or other potential hikers. So hopefully hearing this has helped you figure out how you can work around some of your concerns, and I hope that you enjoy your next hike tremendously. Thanks for watching.